Okay. A warm welcome. So good to see all of you here. Excuse me. Taking care of your lives in this way, coming to a Dhamma talk. And as usual, we are recording this on YouTube. It's not exactly live, but it will go up on the public YouTube channel later, assuming that all goes well. But if there's any concerns, then feel free to let me know. And as usual, we'll also give ourselves a chance to settle in and arrive with some meditation for about 30 minutes or so to begin with. And this evening, I thought that would be good to would be helpful to begin with a meditation on loving kindness, something to warm up our hearts, so to speak, and open our minds. Open our minds. And we're going to do something akin to the recitation form rather than the radiating form. So we'll be using a word or a phrase, sort of spark that quality as we go along. But for now, you can go ahead and just begin to feel this body settling into meditation posture. Really sensing that natural stability of the body resting on the seat beneath you. Allowing the belly to soften and relax. Sitting upright to allow the muscles of the chest and the shoulders perhaps to also soften and relax. And bringing to mind some sort of image that reminds you of kindness. It's a very simple kind of kindness. Just sparking that quality of kindness in the mind. And having sparked that quality of kindness, then you can release the image and turn to the breath, breathing the body. And every few breaths, just dropping in that word, kindness. Breathing in kindness, breathing out kindness. Returning to the image if that helps to support the quality of kindness in this breath. And the quality of kindness with each breath. Just offering yourself some kindness in this moment. Offering yourself a few more breaths of kindness. And then thinking, choosing some other being and offering that being some breaths of kindness. Still breathing kindness in and out and sharing that with some other being. returning to the image. If that helps the quality of kindness to be present. Sharing kindness. And now, if your breath of kindness is feeling strong, sharing that kindness with all beings. Every few breaths, offering kindness to all beings. Kindness. Every few breaths, returning to that reminder. Kindness for all beings. And remembering to include yourself in kindness for all beings. Breathing in kindness, breathing out kindness. Wonderful. So that was the meditation practice for this evening. And it's a little different way of doing the metta, loving kindness meditation. Happy to talk about that later if that's of interest or if you have questions. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and move right into the Dhamma talk for this evening. So make whatever adjustments you need to there in terms of your sitting. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Today is the second Tuesday in November, and that means that it's election day here in the United States. A day that can feel like pretty high tension day, a day where perhaps the stakes feel very high, the sense of separation or the sense of difficulty, the sense of difference. Separation can be very strong. And so I wanted to speak today about that, about how to work with that sense of separation, how to work with the sense of difference. And in particular, to do so by moving toward cultivating our ability to meet what's true, meet reality. And the path of Dhamma is designed, actually, I would suggest, to take us beyond our sense of self, our constrained, separate, independent sense of self. In a funny way, it goes very strongly against some of our cultural norms here in the States, but in other places too. And this ideal of going beyond ourselves, of stretching our minds beyond our sense of self, is very possible, is in fact very beneficial to go beyond these self-colored glasses, so to speak, that we have. But it's only really possible if we allow something noble in ourselves to come forth, to be known. It's only possible if we allow the path to bring forth something that is much more clear and upright than this sense of separation actually is. So we have to allow the path to spark something beautiful in us in order for it to help stretch us beyond these limits that we feel. And so we have to be willing to be in touch with ourselves, with our own truths, no matter what they are, actually, to arrive at that point of being moved deeply and moved in a direction that will bridge this gap, this perceived gap. And the alternative, I would suggest, is not so pretty. The alternative is what we would call spiritual bypassing. The spiritual bypassing is a phrase that was developed by a man named John Wellwood. Is it John? Let me make sure that I got the name right. Yes. John Wellwood, long time ago, way back in the 80s. He developed this term, spiritual bypassing, and he defines it as using spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing our unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished business, unfinished developmental tasks. So using spirituality as a way to actually avoid our truths, to actually avoid the reality of what we experience. That's what spiritual bypassing is all about. And it's easy to use Buddhism for that purpose. It's also easy to use other spiritual traditions, but certainly Buddhism has lots of language that can be inappropriately taken up. The Buddha uses this metaphor of kusala grass. He says, if you grasp the Dhamma the wrong way, or like the snake, there's also the simile of the snake. I like that one too. If you grasp the Dhamma in the wrong way, it will bite you. So you have to grasp the Dhamma from the head end and not the tail end. So what is it that we're asked to do? Well, we're asked to really turn toward truth, right? Turn toward the reality of our experience. And that is why the first of the truths, and so the Buddha didn't just give us one truth to work with, thankfully, he gave us many, many, many. But the first of the four truths is that there is dukkha, there is unsatisfactoriness or suffering or, I would say. Some people use stress. There was one particular Dhamma teacher who likes to use stress for dukkha, but I think that that's actually too light. In many cases, dukkha can be much worse than what we think of as stress. So this unsatisfactory, deeply unsatisfactory, gnawing at you unsatisfactoriness of human existence. And so the task that we're given, or the exhortation, is to understand this truth, to understand this truth in our own lives, to be able to face it directly. And what would that mean? Well, for me, and I think for many people, but for me in particular, it meant coming to the understanding that the problems of my life were not going to be resolved by any other means. They're not going to be resolved by food or sex, drugs, rock and roll, music, right? Or power, money, vacations, none of the above. Those things aren't going to truly resolve the problem, aren't going to truly meet the reality of my life. And so we need to have a look at what the reality of life is for, it seems, quite some time in order to understand it a bit better, in order to acknowledge this reality of dukkha, and also to begin to unpack how that happens. But this turning toward the reality of our lives is also true about the reality of our experience of others. in our sphere. And that is a place, again, where it can be quite fraught. We're trying to understand ourselves, but let alone trying to actually understand others and where other folks are coming from is a big job. Can seem like a big job. But I want to suggest that even folks who are diametrically opposed can do this. And I brought an example. So there's a story that I want to tell you. And it's an example from a while ago, actually. There's a book written about it called Not by the Sword. Not by the Sword. It's a book about a series of events that occurred in the early 90s to a rabbi, Rabbi Michael Weiser. And Rabbi Michael Weiser and his wife, his then wife, Julie, and their kids had moved to Lincoln, Nebraska, in the hopes of finding a place where they would experience less anti-Semitism. But little did they know that that wasn't the case, actually, that Lincoln was the home of another very strong leader who was the leader. He was a grand dragon, a so-called grand dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, a man by the name of Larry Trapp. So when the Weisers moved to Lincoln, they started receiving nasty letters in the mail and harassment. One letter was, "The KKK is watching you, scum," and included pamphlets about anti-Black and anti-Jewish sentiments. And so Larry Trapp, this person who was a grand dragon, so not a dragon as we would understand it in Buddhism. Dragons usually stand for enlightened, powerful, enlightened beings with a tremendous amount of wisdom. This is not that kind of dragon. But Larry found out that the Weisers had moved to Lincoln and wanted them to leave, and so began this harassment campaign and began actually encouraging other folks in the KKK locally to harass them, call them, and things like that. And so at first they kind of didn't know what to do, says Rabbi Weiser, and then they decided, well, the thing to do is to try to talk to this person, try to actually figure out what's really going on here for this person in particular who is leading this charge. And so when he would call to harass them, and then whoever answered the phone, but I think in particular, Michael said, well, one time he called and he started, unleashing a bunch of nastiness at me on the phone. And I said, well, there's a lot of love out there, Larry, and you're missing it. You're just missing out on all of it. That was his message for Larry, in the midst of all this nastiness that Larry was spewing at him. And it kind of reminded me of that moment, of several moments that are depicted in the suttas, but in particular one moment where there's a Brahmin who is chewing out the Buddha, right? And the Buddha says, hey, I'm not going to take on your anger. I'm not receiving that gift from you today. So in any event, they kept interacting with Larry, and they found out that he was diabetic and that he was really struggling with his health, so much so that he was nearly blind and also in a wheelchair. And so they offered to go grocery shopping for him. And he was floored. He ignored the offer for a while. And then finally he said, oh, okay. I'm going to take advantage of these people or whatever. And he said yes. And he allowed them to go grocery shopping for him. And then they said, well, how about dinner? Let's have dinner. We bought the groceries. We'll bring them over and let's have dinner. So they had dinner at his place where he had pictures of Hitler on the wall and some really incredible, they said, incredibly nasty things, decorating the house. But they stayed in communication with him. They stayed in communication with him and continued to reach out to help him. And ultimately, Larry actually began to see that he cared about them, that it wasn't just about them buying him groceries and him taking advantage of them, but that he actually cared about them as people. He wanted to know more about them. He wanted to see them for dinner again. And so he set down his title as the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in that part of the country and wrote an apology letter to all of his followers and said, you shouldn't be doing that thing that we've been doing. This is not a good thing. To all of his followers, he wrote this letter saying, I'm sorry that I've been misleading you all this time because you're doing the wrong thing now. I realize that now. And he became such close friends with the Wisers that as his illness progressed and he got close to the end of his life, he actually lived with them for a little while and they took care of him. So it's a very interesting story of how their ability to stay engaged with this man, to go beyond their personal sense of being attacked and stay engaged with this person and acknowledging what was true, what was actually going on, not ignoring what was actually going on, right? They weren't being Pollyanna. They understood that he was trying to harass them. But actually meeting him as a human being, right? Seeing him as a human being, as someone who also had the capacity to go beyond his own self-view, his own sense of identity, his own constraints. They saw him in that way, and in part made it possible. So it's a very, very beautiful story, and it's made possible by, I think, the way that our minds and our hearts can be stretched by compassion and by seeing the truth, and the truth specifically of our shared experience as human beings. Because, as I've said many, many times, each one of us is an individual with a completely unique set of karmic circumstances, with a completely unique mind and body. And yet, we have also a shared experience. There are things that are universally true about the human experience. Both of those things are true in any given moment. That's why we can talk about a path to awakening. That's why we can talk about a path that transcends the mistaken sense of self. Because there are these universals, this very, very clear common ground. And yet each one of us has to find it individually. Each one of us has to find it individually. So, as usual, I brought a sutta to illustrate the point as well, in addition to this story about Rabbi Weiser and Julie Weiser, and there's a reference to this this way of thinking about the world, engaging with the world, in a sutta called the Honeyball Sutta. It's a middle-length discourse number 18. And the Honeyball Sutta is a little bit of a complicated one, has some enigmatic phrases in it. And to tell you briefly. I'm not going to try to unpack the whole thing, but there's one particular aspect that I do want to point to, and it's this aspect of this non-contention. So the sutta starts out by the Buddha living in the Sakyan country at Kapilavastu in Navgroda's park. So he's in his home, he's on his home turf, so to speak. He's a Sakyan, right? That's the Buddha. It's called Shakyamuni because that was his tribal name, the Sakyan clan. And so there he was, and he ran into another person from his clan named Dandapani. And Dandapani was known for being, let's put it politely and say, a bit of a curmudgeon. So Dandapani is walking around, and he has a cane. He uses a cane, even though there's something in there about not being clear why he needs the cane, but nonetheless, that's what he does. And the Buddha runs into Dandapani, and Dandapani exchanges greetings with him. And then when this courteous and amiable talk was finished, Dandapani stands to one side, leaning on his cane, and asks the Blessed One, "What does the recluse assert? What does he proclaim?" So it's a very pointed question. A very pointed question. He's not using any kind of respectful address of the Buddha, and he's not, and he's basically demanding a elevator pitch, right? What is it? What is it that you teach in 20 words or less? And the Buddha responds by saying this. He says, "Friend, I assert and proclaim my teaching in such a way that one does not quarrel with anyone in the world. In such a way that perceptions no more underlie that person who abides detached from sensual pleasures." This is how Bhikkhu Bodhi is translating it. Detached from being dragged around by food and other things that I mentioned earlier. Without perplexity, without confusion, shorn of worry, and free from craving for any kind of being. So he says, I proclaim my teaching in such a way that one doesn't quarrel with anyone in the world. Because of their inward non-attachment, this is what he's saying. Because of their inward non-attachment. So how would that be the case? So this is where the sutta gets kind of interesting, because that is what the other practitioners then ask him. So before we get to the other practitioners asking, though, there's this very, very funny line where it says, "And when this was said, Dandapani the Sakyan shook his head, wagged his tongue, raised his eyebrows until his forehead was puckered in 3 lines, and departed." So it didn't go over well, okay? We're very clear about that part. That this answer didn't go over well, right? Because why? Because he was interested in a fight, but he didn't get a fight out of the Buddha. That's why it didn't go over well. Because the Buddha is saying, I'm not going to argue with you. I'm not going to quarrel with you. So then the students come and ask the Buddha, well, how is it? How is it? And this is where the sutta gets a little complicated. But suffice to say that what he says is, if you are not holding to this underlying tendency of mental proliferation, this underlying tendency to aversion, to views, to doubt, to ignorance, then that is the end of resorting to weapons, to quarrels, to disputes, to false speech. All of those states, unwholesome states, cease. So not holding on to this underlying tendency to views, and in particular, what kind of views? Views that are stories that we add on top of the experiences that we have. That's what this mental proliferation, the Pali word for it is papancha. It's the way in which we take an experience and we spin a whole set of implications, stories, opinions about it. And we get all spun up and caught up by that. So I'm going to tell you one more story example, and then I'm going to end the talk for tonight, because there are a lot of various and sundry pieces that I could continue to go into in the sutta. But rather than that, I just want to give one more example. And that was, and it's a story that some of you have heard already, but I think that this one often bears repeating. And it's a story about when I was living at San Francisco Zen Center. And I think it was in the years after the Japan training. And I was there, and there were two people who are always assigned to carry the master key, because it's a residence for about 60 folks. And inevitably, somebody would lose their key or lose their purse or not be able to get into their room. They accidentally lock the door. And those things would happen at like 2 a.m. So the director had two, what we called residence reps, who would help, who would have the key, so that there were three of us then who could help somebody to get in if they needed help getting into their room or into the building. And so I and this other gentleman were the residence reps, and he and I had very, very, very different communication styles. We had very different communication styles and lots of different views, let's put it that way. And so he and I were just simply trying to decide how to post our phone numbers on the bulletin boards. So there were two main residential buildings, well, three actually, main residential buildings. And the master keys that we held were to two of them. And I lived in one and he lived in the other. And so his idea was that we would put his phone number on the building that he lived in, posted on the bulletin board, and we would put my phone number on the building that I lived in. But I said, I think it would make sense to put both of our numbers in both buildings, because that way we can help more people if need be. And so we finally got through that, and we decided, okay, that's how we're going to do it. We're going to put up a little sign with both of our phone numbers on the bulletin board in the main building and in the secondary residential building. And he had offered to do it, this gentleman. And a day goes by, 2, 3, 4 days go by, and there is no thing. There's no little posting being made on the bulletin board. And I'm waiting, and I'm not saying anything. I'm not saying anything to him. I'm like, no, we talked it out. We talked it through. We came to an agreement. Surely it's going to happen. And then one day I walk into the building and I look at the bulletin board, and there's a piece of paper up there with just his name and phone number, and not both of our names and phone numbers. And I was irritated. I was so annoyed. I was just like, we went through this whole conversation and you agreed, and then you don't follow through. And here we've been waiting a week, and then you go and do it wrong. I'm saying all this to myself, right? I'm seeing them. This is all what's happening in my head. And so I said, well, I'm going to talk to him when I see him, I'm just going to talk to him when I see him. I'm not even going to take this thing off the board. I'm just going to have to revisit this. So I see this guy in the hallway and I say to him, oh, hey, I saw that there's a piece of paper up there on the bulletin board with just your name and phone number on it. And before I even got to say anything more, he jumps in and he goes, oh yeah, so-and-so did it because I hadn't gotten around to it. Poof. My whole argument, my whole understanding of what had happened just like disappeared. I was just kind of standing there dumbstruck, like, wow, I thought that I understood what had happened. What was the truth? What was the reality of this situation? And it wasn't the case at all. And look how spun up I had gotten about it. Look at this whole story, at all of this papancha, at all of this mental proliferation, which was completely fictitious, actually, right? Completely based on a fictitious understanding. So in that moment, thankfully, I was just kind of like caught by the truth of it. And I didn't just jump ahead and go, well, you know, if that person would have done it, wouldn't have to have done that. If you had done what you said you were going to do. I didn't get into all of that because I was just so struck with the whole, how much suffering I had just gone through over something that wasn't even real. So that was my moment of meeting my truth at that moment, as well as the truth of what had actually happened there with him. And stopping the whole story and all that momentum long enough to then respond to what's actually true, what's actually here. Not hold to that, all that unpleasant feeling that I have now. Right? But to choose to let that go in favor of a modicum of acceptance of the truth. So I hope that you feel uplifted by some of this today, by knowing that as we often say, the truth will set you free. Much more profoundly, actually, much more profoundly than any other idea about yourself. Any idea you have about yourself or about some other person has almost no power compared to the power of the truth, of meeting what's really here right now.